Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Beth, and for today's video, I am going to be doing another swatch video of the new Natasha Denona Retro Glam palette. So, as I mentioned in my Sephora VIB sale haul, this did indeed pop up on the Sephora app. I think it was on Monday, the last day of the sale, the 7th. So I purchased it from Sephora, but I believe you can now purchase this at obviously Sephora, the Natasha Denona website, Beautylish, and I guess wherever else Natasha Denona is sold. So this retails for $69. It is her midi size. So you may know that she has a variety of different sizes, primarily the larger palettes that retail for over $120. This size, which I believe is my favorite. We also, of course, have the 5 pans. This is the mini retro palette that kind of inspired this palette, and this did come out a few years ago now. So people have been clamoring for a larger version of this palette for a while because, as you may know, Natasha Denona does have a tendency to have like mini palettes. Sometimes that incorporate shades from the larger palette, sometimes they don't. For example, this is the mini Sunset. There is a larger $120-ish palette that's called Sunset, I believe. I also have the mini Star palette, which I showed you in my, I need to zoom out just a tad, my video swatching the My Dream palette, because she did, I think, borrow a shade from this Star palette. But the new Retro Glam palette, I think, is all new shades. There's also the mini Gold, and of course we have, this is the size of the Sunset in her larger palettes. And now they are looking like this, which my Biba palette is a little discolored because it was kind of sitting in the sun. So yeah, so that's basically, I guess, the backstory of this palette. So Natasha Denona said that this eyeshadow palette, the Retro Glam, brings 2 of Natasha's most celebrated creations into a new midi-sized eyeshadow palette concept. This dynamic color story combines the greens, pinks, and neutral nudes of the mini retro, which is this one, of the mini retro eyeshadow palette with a variety of seductive glam eyeshadow palette finishes in a collection of all new shades. So we are taking inspiration from the mini and the Glam, which is the same size as this Retro Glam. So that is what those shades look like. So that's kind of the inspiration for the color story. And you may remember that like when she launched this retro palette, a lot of people were thinking it would be this Retro Glam because this is just the mini retro. We did also have a mini Glam once upon a time. So yeah, I think a lot of people were kind of disappointed by this very kind of mauve-y, rosy color story. But with this Retro Glam, the dream has finally been realized, and we have, I'll show you the packaging. We have this really interesting design. It has kind of a like plastic lip on it. I think this is a new kind of format that she's been playing with. So we had, this was the Glam, and that was kind of the typical packaging, other than having this little star. Like the retro palette is kind of the same idea, basically. She started to branch out a little bit with the My Dream because it has a matte finish and that kind of textured ink splatter type look. So it's kind of fun that she's keeping it fresh. So it says, ranging from muted sage greens and cool browns to shimmering dusty pinks and sparkling champagne nudes, the Retro Glam eyeshadow palette suits every occasion. She says you can use it alone to create mesmerizing multi-dimensional looks or pair with other palettes in the Retro and Glam families for unlimited inspiration. So I thought it was really interesting how she characterized that, because Like I was saying, the color inspiration was the Mini Retro and the Midi Glam. But then when she's saying the Retro and Glam families, I'm not sure if she's including this Mini Glam and also this Midi Retro. So, I mean, you can do whatever you want, obviously, and that kind of leads me to my next point about this type of packaging. So, these are not removable. They're pretty travel friendly as they are, although some of the shades can be a little bit more fragile, like this mini nude palette. This one shade I think I had to press back in a little bit, and the mini gold, which I picked up at Sephora when it was half off, that middle shade as well. I haven't used this yet, but you can see that middle shade I had to kind of press back in as well, and this was half off on sale, and so it's no longer available at Sephora anyway. So the minis, like I said, are pretty travel friendly in size, but just be aware the texture may be a little bit fragile. And the other point, and one of the reasons why I like this palette, although I don't utilize this functionality as much as I could, is that these pans in the midi, and also in a lot of the larger palettes like this, you can see there are holes on the back. So what you could do is you could either kind of mix and match your favorite palettes to create your own color story, or you could pop out your favorite shades and put them into a magnetic palette. So what you would do is you would just open it up. Obviously there is a mirror, and I've left the cover on there so it doesn't have a reflect. But nice big mirror that does stand up if you wanted it to. Also lays flat, which is also nice. And this is just, in general, it's a magnetic palette. So to pop one of these shades out, you would just pop the pin through the back and then carefully pull out the pan, and then you could just pop it back in like so. The one thing about doing this is that the palette or the shade isn't marked on the back, so if you do want to depot them, I would recommend taking like a Sharpie pen and marking it. And if you don't have enough space to write the full name, perhaps you could do like RG and then like number them 1 through 5, 6 through 10, etc. So that way, if you ever wanted to reconstruct the palette, the original palette, without too much effort, it would be kind of laid out for you. So this is a cruelty-free formulation, but it does contain talc and carmine. You can see all of the ingredients on the back here. So I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that on the camera, but there is clearly talc as the first ingredient for a lot of these, and I know I saw carmine. Yeah, it's like right there as well. So it does say that it is an eyeshadow palette, so it doesn't have any kind of restrictions on use around the eyes. It's made in Italy, not tested on animals, and then it's free of a lot of ingredients. I was just reading it, keep out of reach of children, which is funny. I don't think this would be harmful to children, but I'm sure there are many mothers out there who have lost products. Let's just say that. And this does have a net weight of 19.25 grams and 0.67 ounces for 15 shadows, 24-month shelf life, made in Italy, if I didn't already mention that. Yeah, it does have the number and kind of formulation indicator on the back here, and I'll explain what the various formulations are and shade descriptions as I swatch them. So for how to use, I think this is similar to what she's had on other palettes. It says to apply matte eyeshadows with fluffy eyeshadow brushes to blend, or detail brushes for precision. And it says metallic, sparkling, duochrome, and chroma crystal eyeshadows. Apply with dense eyeshadow brushes for a subtle finish. For high payoff foiled finish, apply with a damp eyeshadow brushes or with the tip of your finger. So yeah, so I just think it's helpful to kind of know that, and I think that's basically it in terms of the packaging. So as far as the kind of finish breakdown here, I believe there are 6 shades in her creamy matte formula. So we have, I think, 4 in a row here, and then we have this one and this one. This evergreen shade is in her cream to powder formula. And then I think everything else is pretty much a metallic, with the exception of this flare shade is a sparkling metallic. This flutter shade is a like chroma crystal shade. But like Maxi is a metallic. Jazzy is a metallic. Oscar, Palladian, let's see, Marlin, and Oz are all metallic. So that kind of covers everything, I think. So to talk quickly about how I do my swatches, and as far as her suggested application tips, she does recommend that you use a primer. Of course, she recommends the Natasha Denona eyeshadow base, which I don't have. So I will be using primer on my arms to do my finger and brush swatches because I always use primer on my eyelids, so I feel like that's the best kind of approximation of how the shadow is going to perform on my eyelids. And for the matte shades, I like using the Rephr number 2 brush. So I believe this is an entirely natural hair brush, kind of a fluffy little shader. So that's what I use for the matte shades. For the metallic shades, I like using the Rephr 21. I believe this is a mix of natural and synthetic. And I feel like in this video, especially because Mel Thompson, who passed away a year or 2 ago, I'm not sure exactly when it was, she was a content creator here on YouTube, and she kind of did her own version of what this palette would look like. I can't recall if that was before or after the retro palette came out. But like I said, when we had the mini retro, a lot of people were really excited about this color story. I feel like I need a timeline of Natasha Denona releases. So anyway, she put together a color story of shades that she thought would make this palette. I think she actually used more than 15 shades. But anyway, Sydney Grace is the indie brand that she used singles from, and they have put together a bundle of those shades. And part of the proceeds of that bundle will be going to Mel's family. So I know there are other YouTubers who have mentioned doing kind of comparisons between this Retro Glam palette from Natasha Denona and the shades that Mel had envisioned making up that palette. So be on the lookout for that. If you're not already subscribed to them, I think Teresa is Dead, Jenna Phrase, and Tara Lynn have all talked about it. And I think they were all fairly close to Mel as well, so they had more than just a like viewer-influencer relationship. So anyway, so I wanted to mention that and encourage you to check out the Sydney Grace bundle. The reason I bring that up in particular in talking about these brushes is because Mel was also a fan of Rephr brushes, and I think she was the one who asked Rephr to create this brush. Basically, I had to pull it out here, basically modeling it after the MAC 242. So this is an older MAC brush that was made in Japan, and it could be a mix of natural and synthetic. I'm not entirely sure. I know MAC is now an entirely like synthetic vegan brush line. But anyway, she had asked Rephr to basically create a version of this brush. And just while I'm mentioning it, the Rephr number 2 is very similar to the MAC 239. Again, this is an older 239 that was having difficulty seeing it on the handle. Yeah, this one was also made in Japan. I'm pretty sure this is all natural hair. And speaking of natural hair brushes, so usually this is the part of the video where I say that I do finger and brush swatches of the matte shades, and I have several of these Rephr brushes because obviously going from like a dark to light shade can be kind of difficult. So I want to be able to swap in a new one if I need to. I have 2 of these Rephr number 21 brushes. One I try to keep for a dry brush swatch. So I do a finger swatch, a dry brush, and a damp brush. And normally I use the Tarte Maracuja Miracle Mist, which has a very kind of fine aerosolized mist to it. I might play around with using the MAC Fix Plus. This is kind of the older packaging, and I kind of want to use it up. So this is the rose scent, not that it really matters. It's just basically a glycerin based spray. So we'll see what I end up using, but usually I try to use one dry and one wet. And to clean off my brushes in between, I have been using the Sigma Switch. As I said, some of these are all natural, I believe. Some of them are natural and synthetic. I was trying to look that up earlier today, but I think Rephr has closed down its site effectively to get ready for Black Friday, so I wasn't able to look up any of the brushes. But someone did leave a comment on one of my videos recently saying that the Sigma Switch is intended for use only with synthetic brushes because it could conceivably damage the fibers of natural hair brushes. And they of course recommended using like a microfiber towel, which I have here. This is just a basic one from Amazon. I know like Sonia G sells a towel. So I might play around with using this. I'm not like too precious about these brushes because although they are really nice natural and or synthetic brushes made in Japan, they're also not that expensive, and I kind of use these brushes primarily for swatching. So I'm not too precious with them. I do use the Sigma Switch with my Sonia G brushes, which perhaps I shouldn't, but I did go on the Sigma website earlier today and I didn't see them make that disclaimer. That's not to say they've never said that in the past, but I figure I can probably get away with using it if it's not kind of in like big red letters, like don't use with natural hair brushes. But anyway, the point's well taken, and I might try experimenting with the microfiber towel anyway. Okay, so just scooching out a bit. And the final thing I think I can tell you, I think I already talked about primer. I'm using the Viseart one because it's easily dispensed in the tube. It doesn't really have any kind of color to it. It's just kind of a clear primer. Yeah, so I think as far as like which way I'm going to be swatching this, it's interesting that we have so many of the mattes in one row, and because I'm doing multiple types of brush swatches with the shimmers and metallics, those tend to take up more room on the arm. So I think instead of rows, I'm going to do columns. So I'm going to do 3 at a time. So I will apply primer, do the swatches, remove everything, and then reapply primer and go from there. So I think that's going to be the most successful approach here. Also means I can do all of my finger swatches with one hand. So yeah, as you can see, the primer from Viseart here is pretty just kind of silicone-y in nature. All right, so let's get into some swatches here. So the first 3, we have Flare. It's a sparkling metallic vintage rose with a silver shift, which looks like so. Maxi is a metallic medium dark warm taupe. And then Flutter is a sparkling light champagne pink. And this is the only shadow of this formulation in this palette. So let's put these on the arm. So far, everything seems to be of good quality. This shade here, by the way, it does feel a bit thinner. Like you can tell it is a different texture, and it does kind of feel a little bit more like a topper shade. Oops, picked up a little bit too much. I do show you what the shadows look like after. And this one I had to kind of dig into it to get it up on a dry brush. All right, so taking my microfiber towel. I don't think the exact type of microfiber towel matters too much. Yeah, this one I think picked up better, but you can still see a little bit of the kind of crumbliness of it. As always, you might want to do your eyes first. All right, and then finally the shade Flutter. This is going to be very light, given the texture. It's just kind of a dusting of sparkle. All right, and like I said, I'll try using this. I think this dispenses more product, and I don't think Fix Plus claims to be a kind of longevity spray. So, and often what I say too is that sometimes with metallic shades, I like to use a brush to kind of get the general placement and to get into all the corners. See there, I was able to get a lot more. But then I don't mind going in with a finger to kind of amp up the color. If you have nails or you just find it difficult to use your fingers, like my eyes are a little bit more kind of hooded and deep set, so it's not always easy to get your fingers into all the corners of your eyes. I always suggest using those like little sponge tip applicators that sometimes you get in palettes. I think they're actually really good at applying these types of shades. And then last but not least here, going into Flutter. I'm kind of curious about the names for this palette. Like Flutter, I think of like a butterfly. Maxi, I guess like a maxi dress. All right, so let's take a close look at these shades. So that is the shade Flare with the finger dry brush and wet brush. That is the shade Maxi, which is a finger dry brush and wet brush. So those first two are metallic shades. And then we have the Chroma Crystal, which is the Flutter shade. So we have a finger dry brush and wet brush. All right, so I've removed those swatches and reapplied the primer. This is usually the part where I say, you know, I do my best to kind of create a perfect blank canvas for every kind of row of swatches on my arm, but I'm obviously like washing my arm, and you know, if there's any residual moisture or just the skin texture may be a little bit different. I just want to mention that so you're aware. Okay, so the next column here, we have the shade Jazzy, which is a metallic dark cool brown. And then we also have Sage, which is a matte medium sage green. I'm kind of surprised that she didn't make that one a cream to powder actually. And then finally we have Lucy, which is a matte light limestone. I feel like that shade is going to be very handy for me to have. It's kind of a transition shade. All right, so we have here Jazzy on some of the sage green, kind of fell off my finger, you can see. Her cream to powder formula is not really my favorite, but I think it does have some benefits. Like I said, doing finger swatches on an arm that might be slightly damp does kind of present some challenges. I just wanted to quickly compare Jazzy and Maxi here because they do seem kind of similar. I think Jazzy has more depth to it. I don't know if it was necessary to have both of those in the same palette. Let's see. Maxi is a metallic medium dark warm taupe, and Jazzy is a metallic dark cool brown. So you could probably incorporate both of those shadows into a look and it would be really pretty. I guess part of the benefit to having a 15 pan palette as opposed to 5, for example, is that you can play around with the color stories a little bit more. I think this is the dry brush. So going into Jazzy, you don't have to be as cutthroat with it. say pretty good pigmentation and coverage, but I can see a little bit of kick up there. And then I think this is our first matte shade. So going in with a dry brush into Sage. And yeah, this color story is interesting because obviously we know the inspiration, but the shade names are kind of reminiscent of the holidays, but in a very kind of, I don't know, pastel way. Like we have Sage, we have Holly, we have Evergreen. I think those may be the only like true kind of holiday names I see. So Oscar, we'll see how that one looks, but I don't know if she's kind of channeling the Oscars. And so that's a gold shade. We have Oz. I guess the Wizard of Oz, I would think. Yeah, so a little bit of kick up, a little bit of kind of powder flying off. But, you know, I'm trying to get a good amount of kind of opacity here. So you can see the color. You may be a little bit more cautious applying to your eyelids. And then going into Jazzy. I think that's kind of a thinner metallic formula. Like, I guess the Fix Plus or whatever just really helped it kind of sheer out. All right, so here we have Jazzy. So that's finger, dry brush, wet brush, and I also swatched it next to Maxi. Then we have Sage. And finally, Lucy. Okay, so this next column we have Oscar, which is a metallic light medium vintage champagne. That's definitely up my alley. Holly is a matte light neutral rose. Again, what I was saying about the kind of really desaturated pastel colors here. And then Palladian is a metallic pastel sage green. So we have two kind of sage green colors in here. One is matte and one is metallic. So that would be an easy kind of two shadow look if you wanted to do that. All right, so Oscar. And then you can tell the matte formulas are just kind of falling off my finger. Let's see, Holly. And yeah, I think I might honestly have to move to Unprimed Arms because I feel like that is just not really doing the shade justice. And I think you can tell too, like where it was applied over like the damp primer, it was a little bit darker. And I'm just gonna blow away what is in that Oz shade. All right, so dry brush, let's go into Oscar. Yeah, I don't know if it's the primer I'm using. I was using the Lorac Behind the Scenes primer for a long while, but I finally kind of went through all of the ones I had. I have used the Viseart Art primer on the eyes and it performed just fine, so I don't think it's the fault of the primer. And I think mattes in general tend to apply better with a brush. Like you can see there's definitely some powder kind of flying off there. And then finally Palladian. I know Natasha has some tutorials on, I think, her YouTube channel, and she has different looks like on the product page. I didn't kind of scrutinize those to figure out what shades she used, but I would think that Palladian shade featured pretty heavily. Okay, so going into Oscar with a damp brush. Still seeing some kick up from that Holly shade in the pan. and other shades, I should say. All right, so that one does pretty well. It seems like gold shades are one of the easier shades to formulate. All right, and then last but not least, going into Palladian. So yeah, I don't know that that one really does a whole lot in terms of like pigment when you wet it. I just wanted to compare it next to the Flutter shade. So maybe I'll do one swatch of Flutter so you can see the difference in texture there. And then I'll also compare this to the Oscar shade. Okay, so there is Oscar next to Flutter, and you can kind of see the difference in opacity. This one kind of did pretty well with all three application methods, maybe a little bit more foiled and reflective with the brush actually. And then we have Holly, so we have the finger and the brush. And then we have Palladian, finger, dry brush, wet brush, and I also swatched again Flutter. So you can kind of see the difference in texture for that. So there's still a little bit of that Holly shade in Evergreen and Fringe, so I'm going to try to blow that away. Looks like some of it might still be in Evergreen, but we do what we can. So I think for this row, I'm going to forego the primer because we have one cream to powder and then two creamy mattes. All right, so Evergreen, it is a matte cream powder, medium dark sage green. And I think you can just tell based on the kind of reflect of that there is a difference between this and the creamy mattes in this palette. And I think for these colors, I might actually prefer the cream to powder. So I'm just gonna swatch, well, let's swatch this first. So that's Evergreen. And then we have Fringe, which is a matte pastel sage green. Do you say pastel or pastel? We have a lot of sage greens in this palette. And then finally we have Belle, which is a matte medium dusty rose. So that is this column here. Again, you can see the difference there on my fingers with how it kind of picked up and how the Fringe shade, like the kind of fallout on my arm. Okay, and then this one. This color story actually reminds me of my mother's China pattern. I'll insert a picture of it. For some reason, I remember talking about it in another video, but I can't remember why. I don't think it was created in the 60s, but I could be wrong. So I'm going into Evergreen with a clean brush here. That's what Evergreen looks like. I guess I'll just go ahead and use this other clean brush. Going into Fringe. It would be interesting if Natasha ever did a like fully cream to powder formula or palette. I can see some people really enjoying that. And then finally we have Belle. I'm wondering if this is inspired by Beauty and the Beast. All right, so that's a nice formula. That would actually be a really pretty blush color and formula. I think if you were to pop that shade out maybe and put it in a metallic palette, and then you could just get your blush brush in it without kind of getting into the other shades, that could be really pretty. Okay, so here we have Evergreen. It's a matte cream powder, medium dark sage green. So we have the finger and the dry brush. We have Fringe, which is the matte pastel sage green, finger and brush. And then finally we have Belle, which is the matte medium dusty rose. And I think swatching without primer definitely did a lot better with the mattes on this arm. Okay, so down to the last column here, and you can see that evergreen shade did leave a bit of a mark on my arm. So I always use a primer on my eyelids. I think some people, you know, they might experience staining. I don't typically experience staining, but I don't typically wear a lot of bright colors either. But I just wanted to point that out in case that was something you wanted to consider and how you apply it. And I do wash my arm with dish soap, like Palmolive dish soap. So it is not a gentle cleanser. Okay, so going into this last column, we have Marlin, which is, you guessed it, a metallic light medium sage green. Fay, which is a matte medium muted clay. And then Oz, which is a metallic medium dark muted forest green. So those are the colors there. So I didn't use primer for this last column either, based on how things were swatching with Holly. And like I said, I'm not kind of going in fresh with each column. So I don't know, maybe in the future I'll just forgo the primer altogether. I was thinking that because I do wet brush swatches, maybe that's as good as applying over a primer in terms of kind of the color payoff. The reason I use primer is because shadows just always crease on me. Obviously, I don't have that problem with arm swatches. I don't know. Let me know down below if you think one way is better than the other. I'm always trying to improve the quality of my videos and make sure they're as helpful to you all as possible. So that is the shade Oz. I was also saying in my review of the Lawless palette, the Winter Beach one, that I usually set my primer anyway. So my shadows generally don't go over a sticky base. Sometimes I do still wet the brush for the metallic or shimmer shade that's going to be on top. So typically I'm not applying on top of like a tacky base or a glitter glue or anything like that. But I know everyone has their own preferences. Different things work for different people. Okay, so let's talk about this one. So Marlin, a little bit too much. Marlin is a metallic light medium sage green. We have finger, dry brush, wet brush. I think all of those look pretty good to me. Probably the finger and the wet brush are the best, but still a decent payoff. This one looks very smooth. This is Fay, which is a matte medium muted clay. So we have finger and brush. And then finally we have Oz. So this is the metallic medium dark muted forest green. And we have finger, dry brush, wet brush. Again, all three of those look pretty good. Okay, and as promised, here is the look at the palette after that kind of initial round of swatches. So just to do a few more comparisons here. So I will quickly do some swatches of the original Mini Retro. So this one has a crystal shade like Flutter. It has 2 metallics and 2 creamy mattes. So we have 2 metallics, 2 mattes, and then the one kind of crystal shade. So if you're familiar with this palette, and I'll look up to see how they describe these. So honestly, just comparing these, you can probably kind of dupe most of the vibes with this mini. I need a little bit more here. So if you absolutely loved the mini and you want more, I think this definitely gives you more of those kind of icy greens. Okay, so how they describe these. This one is a light nude with green and blue sparks, Galaxia. And then we have Industrial, which is a green taupe with silver reflect. 60s is a greenish gray. Vintage taupe is an antique rose. And Pixie is a pink with champagne shift. So again, I'll just compare the two kind of crystal shades. And then I'll compare, let's see, Vintage Taupe to, I want to say this one was also in, so one thing you should keep in mind, if I can get this to focus, when you're looking at Natasha Denona's like numbering system, she numbers them sequentially. So you can see this one has like 112, 45, 302, 303, and 304. So 302, 303, and 304 were probably, again, can't get this to focus. Were probably all created for this mini retro palette, but Galaxia and Industrial, I think, were taken from previous palettes. In fact, yeah, Galaxia was originally in the Star palette. You can see here. So she does reuse shades on occasion, and the easiest way to know whether it's a repeat shade is just to take a look at the numbers. Like these, I think, are all new, and they are in the 400. So it goes from like 453 through 467. I think I talk about that a little bit more in depth in my video talking about the BoxyCharm palettes from Natasha Denona. So these, I think, have a similar depth to them. This is the Bell shade, which is like a rose. And then this is the, I think, Vintage Taupe. I'm going to say that one has been reused as well. Maybe I'm thinking of Nude Mauve. So that is kind of the comparison. I do have a swatching video of the retro palette that you can check out to see what these shades look like, but I don't have one of the Glam palette. So there's a couple other things I thought I might do. I just want to kind of swatch all the sage green colors next to each other. So obviously we have Sage. I guess doing this a little out of order. I'm just going to swatch the Holly shade again. Yeah, I mean, I guess it does better without a primer, but it was still a little bit chalky maybe. So that was Holly, Bell, and I think Vintage Taupe. But anyway, going back to Sage, Palladian, Evergreen. All right, and then we have, what is it? Fringe, which is the matte pastel sage green. I'm gonna run out of fingers here. All right, so that's a combination of 4 of the kind of sage colors. So looking at this palette, I think I got some of the probably Bell shade in there. So if you're intimidated by this color story, so looking at it, there's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, there's 6 green shades. So we have Marlin and Oz. Marlin is the sage. They called Oz a forest. So those are all the green shades. So I would suggest if you are intimidated by the color story to kind of approach it in a monochromatic way. So These two colors would be really pretty together. That's Oz and Evergreen. One is kind of a more metallic riff on the other. And then these are all kind of in that more mint blue kind of family. But of course you can, you know, incorporate other shades into that little duo there. There's also 3 kind of pink shades. So I'll just use my other hand. So we have Flare, Holly, and Belle. So you could do that as like a little trio. And then everything else is pretty neutral. So you should be able to create something that looks pretty cohesive. In addition to, you know, these more focused color stories, you can mix and match however you like. But if you are intimidated by this combination of colors, that is where I would suggest beginning. And I did want to also quickly take a comparison look at the ABH palette. So I'm not sure really if there's going to be much comparison. I'll swatch the shade Wings. I think, and maybe you can see, this has a little bit more kind of olive to it. I think ABH has a thicker textured shadow formula as well. So those are the greens. I guess I also swatch Muse and Belle. Muse is definitely going to be dark brown. Yeah, and we're definitely getting into more olives there with that one. So yeah, so these 4 on the end are the ABH. And the ABH formula is also, they say not eye safe, some of these shades. So as we've all said a million times, that is because some of these pigments are not approved by the FDA in the US for use on the eyes. Yeah, definitely not duped. I mean, there's some similarity there, but that one has a lot more kind of, I guess, orange in it. Both of them do. And this shade Lily. Yeah, I think that's really all I see. The other thought I had, I would just compare, this is the shade 60s from the Mini to the shade Liberty. Yeah, not far off really. I think the ABH one seems to have a little bit more pigment. Seems to be darker. But I'll build it up a little bit. Yeah, a little bit more of a green tinge, maybe. Like this one is more olive, this one is a little bit more like true green. Anyway, I hope you guys found that interesting or helpful in deciding whether or not to pick up this palette. I would be happy to do any more kind of comparison swatches on my Instagram. So just let me know down below if you have any specific requests. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe. And I will talk to you soon. Bye.